The morning sun rose over the Galactic Military Academy on planet Vexthra, casting long shadows across the training grounds where cadets from 100 different worlds prepared for another day of intense instruction and competition. But for Jake Morrison, this morning felt different somehow, heavier with tension. He couldn't quite name yet. Jake walked through the corridor toward the mess hall, his boots making soft sounds on the polished floor that had been walked on by thousands of warriors before him. Warriors from species that had conquered star systems and fought in legendary battles across the galaxy. And now here he was, a human from Earth, the first of his kind to ever step foot in this ancient institution that had existed for 300 years without ever accepting a Deathworlder into its ranks. Other cadets moved past him in the hallway, some nodding briefly in acknowledgement, while others pretended not to see him at all, their eyes sliding away whenever he tried to make contact. And Jake had grown used to this treatment over the past 3 months since he arrived. But that didn't make it any less isolating or frustrating when all he wanted was to prove himself worthy of the chance. He'd been given his roommate Zekthar waited for him near the entrance to the dining area. All 4 of his arms crossed in a gesture that Jake had learned meant concern among the Quillen people who came from a world where body language was as important as spoken words. "You look tired," Zekthar said quietly as Jake approached, his large eyes studying his human friend with genuine worry that made Jake feel grateful for at least one ally in this place. "Didn't sleep well," Jake admitted. And it was true. He'd spent half the night reviewing tactical scenarios for today's simulation test, knowing that every move he made was watched and judged more harshly than any other cadet, simply because of where he came from. They entered the mess hall together, and Jake grabbed a tray of food that had been specially prepared for his biology, proteins and nutrients that Earth-based life required. So different from what most other species ate that the kitchen staff had to learn entirely new preparation methods just for him as they sat down at their usual table near the back wall. Jake noticed a group of upperclassmen watching him from across the room, their expressions dark and unwelcoming in a way that made his instincts prickle with warning. "Those are the ones I told you about," Zekthar whispered, leaning closer so his voice wouldn't carry to other tables. Jake didn't need to ask who his friend meant. He'd noticed this particular group before, always watching him during training exercises, always whispering among themselves whenever he passed by in the corridors. And their leader Vergen was the worst of them all. A massive Krillex warrior who stood nearly 8 feet tall and had the build of someone who could tear through steel plating with his bare hands. "What do they want?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They think you don't belong here," Zekthar said simply, his voice sad because he understood the injustice of it all. "They believe the Academy made a mistake accepting a human, that Deathworlders are too primitive and dangerous to train alongside civilized species." Jake felt anger rise in his chest, but pushed it down the way his father had taught him before he left. "Earth, let your actions speak louder than words. Show them what you're made of through deeds, not arguments. Prove yourself worthy through excellence, not conflict." After breakfast came combat training in the main gymnasium, a massive space with adjustable gravity fields and holographic opponents that could simulate any enemy type from across known space. And today, Commander Velkoth had them running through close quarters, scenarios that tested reflexes and decision-making under pressure. Jake moved through the simulation with focused intensity, his body responding to threats before his conscious mind fully registered them. A skill that came from growing up on Earth, where predators had evolved alongside humans for millions of years, where survival meant reading danger in the rustle of grass or the shift of shadows. He completed his run in record time, faster than any other cadet in his class, and faster than most upperclassmen had managed when they were first years. But instead of praise, he received only a curt nod from Commander Velkoth, whose scaled face revealed nothing of what he thought about the human's performance during The afternoon academic sessions, Jake struggled more. Advanced mathematics, involving calculations across different dimensional frameworks that made his head hurt. But he persevered because giving up wasn't in his nature. And his instructors had noted that while he might not grasp abstract concepts as quickly as some species, his practical problem-solving abilities were exceptional. Day wore on through weapons training, where Jake's grip strength surprised everyone. Through tactical planning sessions where his unconventional approaches often caught opponents off guard. And through physical conditioning that left other cadets gasping while Jake barely seemed winded. Another advantage of coming from a high-gravity world where every movement required more effort, and built stronger muscles as evening approached and most students headed to the recreation areas or their quarters. Jake decided to get in extra time at the combat training center, pushing himself harder than required because he knew that being good wouldn't be enough. He had to be exceptional, had to prove beyond any doubt that humans deserved their place among the stars. The training center was nearly empty when he finished his workout 2 hours later. Just a few dedicated students still practicing their forms in the far corners of the facility. And Jake grabbed his gear bag and headed for the exit, choosing to take a shortcut through the maintenance corridors that would get him back to his quarters faster. These lower passages were dimly lit and rarely used by students, mostly just maintenance crews during the day shift. But Jake wasn't worried because the academy was supposed to be safe, a place where warriors trained together regardless of their differences or origins. Corridor stretched ahead of him, with pipes running along the ceiling and junction, boxes mounted on the walls at regular intervals, and his footsteps echoed slightly in the enclosed space, creating a rhythm that almost felt peaceful after the intensity of his workout. Then he heard other footsteps behind him, not the casual pace of someone heading home, but the deliberate stride of people moving with purpose. And Jake's instincts flared with warning because something about those footsteps felt predatory and intentional. He picked up his pace without making it obvious, his heart rate increasing as his body prepared for potential danger, the way millions of years of evolution had programmed it to respond. And he considered his options: turn around and confront whoever was following, break into a run and try to reach a more populated area, or continue walking and hope he was just being paranoid before he could decide. 3 figures stepped out from a side passage ahead of him, blocking the corridor with their bodies. And Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized them immediately behind him. The footsteps grew closer, and he turned to see 4 more cadets emerging from the shadows, their faces set with grim determination. And in the center of the group behind him stood Vergen, the massive Krillix warrior whose hatred for Jake had been obvious from day one. Going somewhere, human? Vergen's voice rumbled through the corridor like distant thunder. Full of menace and barely contained violence, Jake's mind raced through possibilities and scenarios, calculating odds and looking for exits. But he already knew the truth. They'd planned this carefully, chosen this location specifically because there were no security cameras in the maintenance areas, no witnesses to whatever they intended to do 7 against 1 in a dark corridor beneath the academy. And Jake Morrison was about to learn just how much some people feared what they didn't understand. Jake stood perfectly still as the 7 cadets formed a loose circle around him, their bodies blocking any escape route from the maintenance corridor that suddenly felt much smaller and more confined than it had just moments before. And his training kicked in automatically. Assess the threats, identify the leader, look for weaknesses in their formation, control your breathing and stay calm no matter what. Vergen stepped forward from the group behind Jake, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire corridor as he moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation in his entire life. And his 3-fingered claws flexed at his sides in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate anyone watching. "We've been waiting for the right moment to have this conversation," Vergen said, his voice dripping with contempt as he looked down at Jake from his superior height. "And now that we're alone without any instructors or security watching, I think it's time we discussed your future at this academy." Jake kept his expression neutral, even though his heart was pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. And he knew that showing fear now would only make things worse. Predators always attacked when they sensed weakness. Whether they were animals on Earth or aliens in a space academy. "I don't want any trouble," Jake said calmly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "We can all just walk away from this and pretend it never happened." This response seemed to enrage Vergen even more because his face darkened, and he took another threatening step closer until Jake could smell the strange metallic scent that all Krillix gave off when they were angry or excited. "Walk away." Vergen laughed, and the sound was harsh and cruel in the enclosed space. "That's exactly what we want you to do. Walk away from this academy. Get on a transport back to your primitive little world. And never return because you don't belong here among real warriors." The others moved in tighter, forming an even smaller circle that left Jake with almost no room to maneuver. And he recognized each of them from various classes and training sessions. Dex, the quick one from a species known for lightning-fast reflexes. Marisol, whose people could generate electrical discharges through their skin. Grix and Ventar, who were brothers from a heavy-gravity world similar to Earth, but not quite as extreme. Karadash, who carried himself like someone trained in assassination techniques. And Solvik, whose species was known for having naturally armored skin that could deflect most blade weapons. "The Academy accepted me just like they accepted you," Jake said, still trying to find a peaceful solution, even though he knew it was probably hopeless. "I passed the same entrance exams, met the same requirements, and I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." "Requirements?" Vergen spat the word like it was poison. "The only reason you're here is because the Council wanted to look progressive and inclusive. But everyone knows humans are nothing but violent savages from a death world who'll probably snap and kill someone the first time they get stressed." Jake felt anger flare hot in his chest at the unfairness of that accusation. Yes, Earth was classified as a death world because of its harsh conditions and dangerous wildlife. But that didn't make humans savage or uncontrollable. And the fact that he'd spent 3 months at the Academy without a single violent incident should have proved that I've never caused any problems, Jake said quietly, his hands hanging loose at his sides, even though every instinct screamed at him to prepare for combat. "I followed every rule, respected every instructor, and treated everyone with courtesy, even when they didn't return it. That's because you're weak." Dex hissed from Jake's left side, his voice sharp and cutting. "You're afraid to show your true nature because you know what would happen if you did. They'd realize the mistake they made and throw you out immediately." Jake turned slightly to face Dex, which was exactly what they wanted him to do, because it meant taking his eyes off the others for just a moment. And in that instant, Vergen gave some signal that Jake didn't see, but everyone else clearly understood. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. A coordinated assault that they must have practiced specifically for this moment. The next lunged forward from Jake's side while Marisol moved in from behind and Solvik rushed from the front. 3 opponents attacking in perfect synchronization to overwhelm their target before he could react, but Jake's body moved before his conscious mind fully processed what was happening. Instincts honed through growing up on a world where split-second reactions meant the difference between life and death. And his reflexes were faster than they had any right to be because Earth's gravity had built muscles and neural pathways that responded with incredible speed. He twisted sideways in a movement that seemed impossible for someone of his size, and Dex's charge carried him past where Jake had been standing just a fraction of a second before, and the alien cadet couldn't stop his momentum in time. he slammed into the corridor wall with a sickening crunch that echoed through the enclosed space. The others froze for just a heartbeat, shocked that their carefully planned opening move had failed so spectacularly. And Jake used that moment of hesitation to create distance between himself and Marisol, who was still moving toward him from behind. "Stop this now," Jake said urgently, his voice harder than before because he knew what was coming next and he didn't want it to happen. "You don't understand what you're starting here." Vergen's expression shifted from confident superiority to something darker and more dangerous. The look of someone whose pride had been wounded and who wouldn't stop until he'd inflicted serious pain in return. "Well, we're starting," Vergen growled, and now all pretense of casual intimidation was gone, replaced by pure rage. "You just assaulted a cadet, and now you're threatening us?" That's exactly the kind of savage behavior we expected from a human. Jake wanted to point out that Dex had attacked first, and he'd only defended himself. But he knew that logic and reason had left this situation far behind. And these 7 cadets weren't going to stop until they'd proven whatever twisted point they thought they needed to. Marisol recovered from her surprise, and her skin began to glow with the telltale blue shimmer that meant she was building up an electrical charge, preparing to discharge it directly into Jake's body if she could get close enough to make contact. Grix and Ventar separated and began to circle around opposite sides of the corridor, using their numbers advantage to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. And Kardashian moved towards something at his belt, probably a blade, because Jake had heard rumors that some cadets carried weapons despite Academy regulations forbidding them. "Last chance," Jake said. But even he could hear the change in his own voice, the shift from peaceful human, trying to avoid conflict, to something older and more primal. The voice of a predator that had been backed into a corner with no escape available. Everand's answer was to charge forward with a roar that shook the air itself, his massive body moving with surprising speed for something so large. And behind him the others surged forward as well, all pretense of a fair fight abandoned in favor of overwhelming force. And that's when Jake Morrison stopped holding back the part of himself he'd been carefully restraining since the moment he arrived at the Academy, the part that came from millions of years of evolutionary pressure on a world that didn't forgive weakness or hesitation, the part that understood violence in ways that most civilized species had forgotten or never known in the first place. His body moved with fluid grace as he met Vargan's charge head-on instead of trying to evade it, and his strike was perfectly aimed at the nerve cluster in the Krillex warrior's torso that every anatomy class had taught them was a weak point, the kind of precise attack that only worked if you had studied your enemy and knew exactly where to hit. Vorgan's eyes went wide with shock and pain as Jake's fist connected, and his momentum carried him forward another 2 steps before his legs gave out and he crashed to the floor like a falling tree. The corridor erupted into chaos as the remaining 6 attackers realized their terrible mistake. Marisol was the first to react after Vergen went down, her skin blazing bright blue as she released the electrical charge she'd been building up, and streams of energy arced through the air toward Jake, who should have been incapacitated immediately by the voltage that could stun most species into unconsciousness. But Jake had grown up on Earth where electrical storms were common and where evolution had given humans a remarkable ability to survive electrical shocks that would kill creatures from more stable worlds. And his muscles seized momentarily before his nervous system adapted and grounded the excess energy through his feet into the metal floor. Marisol's expression shifted from confident victory to confused horror as Jake shook off the attack like it was nothing more than an annoying static shock. And before she could build up another charge, his hand shot out and struck her in the solar plexus with just enough force to knock the wind from her lungs without causing permanent damage. She crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. And Jake felt a twinge of guilt, even though she'd literally just tried to electrocute him. He didn't want to hurt these people, but they'd left him no choice by attacking first, and refusing to back down. Grix and Ventar came at him together from opposite sides. Using coordination they must have developed growing up as brothers who trained together their entire lives. And their species was known for having thick hides and powerful muscles built for their worlds. Intense gravity that was almost as strong as Earth's, but not quite. Jake met Grix's charge with a deflection technique he'd learned in basic combat training, using the alien's own momentum against him to send him stumbling past. And then he pivoted to face Ventar, whose massive fist was already swinging toward Jake's head in a blow that would have knocked him unconscious if it connected. Time seemed to slow down the way it always did when Jake's adrenaline kicked into high gear, a gift from his evolutionary heritage that came from ancestors who'd hunted prey across vast distances and fought off predators that could tear a human apart with claws and teeth. And in that stretched moment, he could see every detail of Ventar's attack and calculate exactly how to counter it. Ducked under the swing and drove his shoulder into Ventar's midsection, using leg strength developed from a lifetime in Earth's crushing gravity to lift the much larger alien off his feet and slam him into the corridor wall hard enough that the metal paneling dented from the impact. Bender slid to the floor with a groan, and Jake spun around just in time to see Kardash lunging forward with a wicked-looking blade that gleamed in the dim lighting of the maintenance corridor, the kind of weapon that was definitely against Academy regulations, but that some cadets carried anyway for exactly this kind of situation. The blade sliced through the air toward Jake's torso in a strike meant to intimidate rather than kill, because Kardash probably just wanted to scare the human into running away. But the edge was sharp enough that it caught Jake's forearm as he brought it up to block, and blood immediately began to flow from the shallow cut. Pain flared hot and sharp, but Jake's training took over. Assess the injury, determine if it's life-threatening, continue fighting if possible, and he realized that while it hurt like hell, the cut wasn't deep enough to have hit anything vital. So he pushed the pain into a distant corner of his mind where it could wait until after the threat was dealt with. Kardash's eyes widened when he saw the blood, because he'd clearly expected Jake to retreat or at least hesitate after being cut. But instead, the human's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous, the look of someone who'd crossed a line from defensive fighting into something more aggressive. Jake's next strike was faster and harder than anything he'd shown before. A straight punch that caught Kardash in the jaw and sent him spinning backward to crash into Salvik, who was trying to move in from behind. And both aliens went down in a tangle of limbs and confused shouts. Vex had recovered from his collision with the wall and now came at Jake again, having learned from his first mistake and approaching more carefully, this time with hands raised in a proper fighting stance. And his species' natural speed made him incredibly difficult to track as he feinted and dodged, looking for an opening. But speed meant nothing if your opponent could predict where you were going to be. And Jake had spent 3 months watching Dex in training sessions and combat simulations. He knew the patterns, recognized the tells that came before each movement. And when Dex finally committed to a real attack, Jake was already moving to intercept. His counterstrike was perfectly timed, catching Dex mid-lunge and redirecting him face first into the corridor floor where he lay stunned and motionless. And Jake felt his breathing start to get heavier as the physical exertion, combined with the adrenaline dump, began to take its toll on even his enhanced. Endran Sesovic was back on his feet now and approaching cautiously. his armored skin gleaming in the low light as he moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been seriously hurt in a fight because most weapons simply bounced off his natural defenses. Your friends made a mistake attacking me, Jake said, his voice rough from exertion and stress. And you're about to make the same one if you don't stop right now. Selvika's response was to laugh and charge forward with arms outstretched to grapple Jake into submission using superior weight and those armored plates that made him nearly invulnerable to strikes. And under normal circumstances, this tactic would work perfectly, because how do you hurt someone whose skin is basically natural body armor? But Jake had learned something important during his time at the academy. Every species had weaknesses that their natural advantages tried to compensate for. And Solvik's weakness was that his armor made him slower and less flexible than opponents without such defenses. Jake didn't try to punch through the armor like Solvik expected. Instead, he went for the joints where flexibility required thinner coverage, striking at the elbows and knees with precise attacks that targeted nerves and pressure points that worked the same way across most bipedal species. Regardless of their external defenses, Solvik went down hard, his armored body making a loud clang as it hit the metal floor. And he lay there making pain noises that suggested Jake's strikes had been even more effective than he'd hoped. That left only Vergen and Grix still capable of fighting, with Grix looking uncertain now as he realized that his brother and 5 other cadets had been defeated by this supposedly primitive human who they'd all assumed would be easy to intimidate and overpower. Varn pulled himself back to his feet, one hand pressed against his torso where Jake's initial strike had landed, and his expression was a mixture of pain, rage, and something else, fear perhaps, or the dawning realization that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. "This isn't over," Vergen growled, his voice strained but still defiant. "You'll pay for this. Human, we'll make sure everyone knows what you did here, how you attacked us without provocation." Jake felt anger surge through him at the sheer audacity of that lie, at the idea that these 7 cadets who'd cornered him in a maintenance corridor with no witnesses could somehow spin this into being his fault. "I have blood on my arm from Kadash's blade," Jake said coldly, holding up his injured forearm where red human blood still dripped onto the floor. "And all 7 of you have injuries consistent with defending myself against multiple attackers. So good luck selling that story to anyone who actually investigates what happened here." Vargan's face twisted with rage as he realized the truth of Jake's words, and he launched himself forward in one final, desperate attack that had no strategy or skill behind it, just pure fury and wounded pride driving him to keep fighting even though he'd already lost. Jake sidestepped the clumsy charge and brought his elbow down hard on the back of Varnen's neck as the Krillix warrior stumbled past. Not hard enough to cause serious injury, but hard enough to send him crashing to the floor for a second time. And this time he didn't get back up. The corridor fell silent except for the heavy breathing of 8 cadets and the quiet groans of pain from those who'd been injured in the fight. And Jake stood among the fallen with his own blood dripping from his arm and his muscles trembling from exertion and adrenaline. In distance, he could hear running footsteps approaching fast. Security had probably been alerted by the automated sensors that detected unusual impacts and sounds in the maintenance areas. And soon there would be questions and investigations and consequences for everyone involved. But right now, in this moment, Jake Morrison just felt tired and sad because this wasn't the way he'd wanted to prove himself. Wasn't how he'd hoped to earn respect from his fellow cadets. And he wondered if things would ever get better, or if being the first human at the academy meant he'd always be fighting battles like this. The security officers arrived within minutes of the fight ending, their faces showing shock and confusion as they took in the scene before them. 7 upperclassmen cadets scattered across the maintenance corridor in various states of injury. and one first-year human standing among them with blood running down his arm, but otherwise appearing relatively unharmed Chief Security Officer Daxron, a veteran from the Centauri military with decades of experience, immediately began scanning the area with his handheld device that recorded everything from structural damage to biological traces. And his expression grew more serious with each passing moment, as the data painted a picture of what had occurred. "Everyone stay where you are," Daxron commanded in a voice that expected instant obedience. And Jake remained motionless while medical personnel rushed in to check on the injured cadets who were groaning and complaining about various pains and injuries. The medics worked quickly and efficiently, scanning each of the 7 attackers with diagnostic equipment before moving to Jake, whose arm was still bleeding steadily from the knife wound. And one of them, a gentle Quillen female named Hextala, carefully cleaned and sealed the cut while asking him quiet questions about any other injuries he might have sustained. "Just some bruises, probably," Jake said honestly, wincing as the medical sealant stung against his torn flesh. "Nothing serious compared to what could have happened." Hextala met his eyes with an expression that suggested she understood more than she was saying, and she whispered softly so only Jake could hear. 7 against 1 is not honorable combat. You did what you had to do." Within an hour, all 8 cadets had been transported to different locations, the 7 attackers to the medical facility for more thorough treatment and observation, while Jake was escorted to a secure room in the administration building where he would wait for the official investigation to begin. The room was small but comfortable, with a bench along one wall and a window that looked out over the academy grounds where other students went about their evening activities, completely unaware of what had just happened. In the maintenance quarters below, Jake sat on the bench and stared at his hands, which were starting to shake now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and he felt the full weight of what had occurred settling onto his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd hurt 7 people, even if it was in self-defense, and there would be consequences regardless of who started the fight. The door opened and Commander Velkoth entered the room, his scaled features unreadable as always, but something in his eyes suggested he was seeing Jake differently now than he had during morning combat training. "Tell me exactly what happened," the commander said without preamble, settling his large frame into a chair that seemed too small for him. "And do not leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." Jake took a deep breath and began to recount everything from the moment he left the training center to the moment security arrived. And he tried to keep his voice steady and factual, even though parts of the memory made his stomach twist with anxiety about how it would be interpreted. Commander Velkoth listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving Jake's face, as if searching for any sign of deception or exaggeration. And when the human finally finished speaking, the commander sat in silence for a long moment before responding. The structural sensors in that corridor recorded the entire incident, Velkoth said quietly. "The data confirms your version of events. They surrounded you. They attacked first, and you defended yourself with what the combat analysis systems describe as remarkable restraint given the circumstances." Relief flooded through Jake so intensely that he felt lightheaded, because he'd been terrified that somehow this would be twisted into being his fault, despite the truth of what happened. "What happens now?" Jake asked, unable to keep the worry from his voice. "Now the Academy Board reviews all the evidence and makes their determination," the commander replied, standing to his full, impressive height. "But I can tell you unofficially that you are not the one who needs to worry about consequences. Those 7 cadets violated multiple regulations, including conspiracy to assault, attacking a fellow student without provocation, and in Kadash's case, carrying an illegal weapon on Academy grounds. Over the next 3 days while the official investigation proceeded, Jake remained confined to his quarters, except for required classes and meals. And during that time, the story of what happened spread through the academy like wildfire. The impossible tale of a first-year human who defeated 7 experienced upperclassmen in solo combat. The reactions were mixed and intense. Some students looked at Jake with newfound respect, while others seemed frightened of him now. And there were heated debates in the common areas about whether humans were too dangerous to be allowed in the academy, or whether the 7 attackers had simply underestimated what Deathworld Origins really means. Sector visited Jake whenever possible, bringing news and updates from the broader student population, and his forearms would gesture animatedly as he described the various theories and rumors that were circulating about the fight. Some people are saying you must have had weapons, Zekthar reported during one visit, because they can't believe one person could defeat 7 others with just bare hands, and others are claiming that humans have secret combat modifications or hidden abilities that weren't disclosed in your admission application. Jake couldn't help but laugh bitterly at that, because the truth was so much simpler and yet so much harder for most species to truly understand. He didn't have secret weapons or special modifications. He just came from a world where survival meant being tougher, faster, and more endurance-capable than most galactic species could imagine. On the 4th day, Jake was summoned to a formal hearing before the Academy Disciplinary Board, and he entered the chamber with his heart pounding to find a panel of 5 senior instructors, including Commander Velkoth, seated behind a raised desk, with Director Lewis, the human administrator who handled diplomatic relations, sitting off to one side. The proceedings were surprisingly quick and straightforward. The evidence was presented, including the sensor data, medical reports, witness statements from the few students who'd seen Jake and the others before they disappeared into the maintenance area, and even testimony from Zekthar about the pattern of harassment Jake had endured over the previous months. When it was Jake's turn to speak, he kept his statement simple and honest, explaining that he'd only wanted to avoid conflict and had defended himself when given no other choice. And he emphasized that he'd been careful not to cause permanent injuries, even when fighting for his life against multiple opponents. The board deliberated for less than 10 minutes before delivering their verdict. Jake Morrison was cleared of all wrongdoing, and his actions were deemed justified self-defense under Academy regulations, while the 7 attackers were placed on immediate probation with the possibility of expulsion if any similar incidents occurred. But what happened next surprised everyone in the chamber, including Jake himself. When asked if he wanted to press for harsher punishment against his attackers, Jake stood and spoke words that would later be repeated throughout the academy. They made a mistake based on fear and ignorance, Jake said carefully, choosing each word with deliberation. And if you expel them now, they'll never learn anything except that they were right to be afraid. But if you give them a chance to understand what really happened, maybe they can become better warriors and better people. The board members exchanged glances that suggested Jake's request was unusual and unexpected. And Director Lewis smiled slightly, as if he'd hoped for exactly this kind of response from his fellow human. Your mercy does you credit, Cadet Morrison, the board chairperson said finally. The 7 cadets will remain on probation as stated, and they will be required to attend cultural sensitivity training, along with additional education about Deathworld species and why certain assumptions about them are dangerously incorrect. As Jake left the hearing chamber, he passed by a waiting area where the 7 attackers sat under guard. And Vergen looked up as the human walked by. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Jake saw something in the Krillex warriors' expression that might have been shame, or maybe the first stirring of actual respect. Later that evening, Jake stood at the window in his quarters, looking out at the stars that seemed so much brighter here on Vexthra than they ever had from Earth. And he thought about everything that had happened since he arrived at this academy that wasn't quite ready for what humanity represented. His Father's words echoed in his mind. Let your actions speak louder than words. And Jake realized that maybe his actions had spoken loudly enough that some people were finally starting to listen. 2 weeks after the incident in the maintenance corridor, the Academy held its quarterly combat tournament, a tradition that dated back to the institution's founding, where cadets from all year levels competed in regulated matches to test their skills and demonstrate their progress. And this tournament would prove to be unlike any that had come before. Jake had been entered into the competition by Commander Velkoth, who stated bluntly that the human needed to prove himself in an official capacity rather than having his reputation rest solely on an unsanctioned fight in a dark corridor. And though Jake had protested that he didn't want special attention, the commander had insisted with a tone that made clear the decision wasn't open for debate. The tournament arena was packed with students and instructors when Jake arrived for his first match, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation because everyone wanted to see the human fight under controlled conditions where the rules would prevent things from getting out of hand like they had in the maintenance. Area's first opponent was a cadet named Thrixinol from the Vexian species, known for their multiple limbs and incredible flexibility. And as they faced each other across the combat circle, Jake could see curiosity rather than hostility in the alien's eyes. This was competition, not personal vendetta. The match began at the referee's signal, and Thrixinol attacked with a flurry of strikes from 4 different angles simultaneously, using all of his limbs in coordination that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Jake had spent 2 weeks reviewing footage of Vexian combat styles, and his body responded with defensive movements that flowed like water around the attacks. He waited for his opening, and when it came, he struck with precision rather than power, targeting nerve clusters that would score points under tournament rules without causing injury. And within 3 minutes, the referee called the match in Jake's favor while Thrixinol bowed respectfully and offered a gesture of acknowledgement that Jake returned with equal respect. The second match was harder because his opponent was a veteran, third-year cadet who'd been fighting in these tournaments for years. But Jake's endurance proved decisive, while his opponent tired after an intense exchange that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Jake was still moving with the same speed and power he'd shown at the start, and eventually superior stamina carried him to victory. Between matches, Jake sat in the competitor's area drinking water and trying to ignore the stares from other cadets, some admiring and others fearful. And Zekthar found him there to offer encouragement in his characteristically enthusiastic way. "You're making history," his Quillen friend exclaimed, all 4 arms gesturing wildly with excitement. "No first year has ever made it past the second round in anyone's memory, and you're about to fight in the quarterfinals." Jake wanted to point out that making history wasn't his goal. He just wanted to prove he belonged here and maybe earn enough respect that he could train in peace. But he smiled at his friend's enthusiasm and prepared. For the next match, the quarterfinal opponent was someone Jake recognized from advanced combat classes, a dangerous fighter from the Kryn species who specialized in close-quarters grappling and had a reputation for never losing matches that went to ground fighting. And the crowd grew quiet with anticipation as the 2 cadets faced each other. The match was brutal and exhausting. Jake managed to keep the fight standing for the first 5 minutes, but eventually his opponent succeeded in taking him to the mat, where the Kryn fighter's natural advantages should have guaranteed victory. But Jake had learned wrestling from his older brother back on Earth, and he'd grown up practicing holds and escapes in gravity that made every movement harder. They rolled and struggled across the combat circle with neither gaining a decisive advantage until Jake finally managed to apply a submission hold that his opponent had no defense against. and the referee stopped the match. When it became clear the Kryn fighter couldn't escape without risking serious injury, the semifinal match was shorter because Jake's opponent had been injured in their previous fight and withdrew rather than risk making the injury worse, which meant Jake advanced to the finals almost by default, a development that made him feel guilty because he wanted to earn every victory rather than advance due to someone else's misfortune. The final match was scheduled for the evening session when the entire academy would be gathered to watch, and Jake had several hours to rest and prepare mentally for what everyone was saying would be the most significant fight of the tournament. His opponent in the finals was Commander Velkoth himself, which was the traditional arrangement where the top-performing cadet faced an instructor in a match. That was meant to demonstrate how much students still had to learn from their teachers. When evening came and Jake entered the arena for the final time that day, the stands were filled to capacity with every student and most instructors present to witness what promised to be an extraordinary match. And he could see the 7 former attackers sitting together in one section. Berganaz's arm was still in a support brace, but his eyes were focused intently on Jake with an expression that was hard to read. Commander Velkoth entered the arena to thunderous applause, his scaled body moving with the fluid grace of a master warrior who'd fought in countless real battles across the galaxy. And when he met Jake's eyes, there was something like approval in his gaze, along with the promise of a serious challenge. "This will not be easy for you, Cadet Morrison," the commander said, as they touched fists in the traditional pre-match gesture of respect. "I will show you what decades of experience can do against youth and raw talent. I wouldn't want it any other way, sir," Jake replied honestly, because the only thing worse than losing would be winning because his opponent held back out of pity or concern. The match that followed was everything the audience hoped for and more. Commander Velkoth fought with skill that came from a lifetime of combat experience, and his strikes were perfectly timed and devastatingly effective when they landed. But Jake's Deathworld reflexes and endurance allowed him to weather attacks that would have ended the match against any other first-year cadet. They fought for nearly 20 minutes, which was almost unheard of in tournament finals, trading strikes and grapples and counters in a display of combat skill that had the audience completely silent except for occasional gasps. When particularly impressive moves were executed, Jake landed several good hits that would have scored points against any other opponent. And he even managed to put the commander in a compromising position twice. But each time, Velkoth's superior experience allowed him to escape and counter with combinations that pushed Jake to his absolute limits. In the end, Commander Velkoth won the match with a technique so advanced that Jake didn't even see it coming until he was on his back with the referee calling the fight. But the commander immediately helped Jake to his feet and raised the human's hand alongside his own in a gesture that brought the entire arena to their feet in applause. "You lasted longer than any first year in the history of this academy," Velkoth said loud enough for the nearby spectators to hear. "And you fought with honor, skill, and the kind of determination that will make you a great warrior someday." The applause continued as Jake left the arena floor, and he noticed that the people cheering included many who'd avoided him or looked at him with suspicion just weeks before. Something had changed in how they saw him. And it wasn't just fear of his capabilities, but genuine respect for how he conducted himself after the tournament ended and the crowds dispersed. Jake found himself approached by Vergan, who moved slowly due to his still healing injuries, and the massive Krillex warrior stood awkwardly for a moment before speaking in a voice that was quiet and uncertain. "I was wrong about you," Vergan said finally, and the words seemed to cost him significant effort to produce. "I judged your species based on fear and stories rather than seeing who you actually are as an individual. And I want you to know that I regret what happened in that corridor. Jake studied the alien's face and saw genuine remorse there mixed with something else. The beginning of understanding, perhaps. Or at least an openness to learning what he'd refused to accept before. I appreciate that, Jake said carefully, extending his hand in a human gesture of reconciliation. And I hope you'll take the opportunity you've been given to learn rather than just resent the consequences. Bergen stared at the offered hand for a moment before reaching out to clasp it with his own larger three-fingered hand. And though the grip was awkward between such different anatomies, the intention behind it was clear enough. Later that night, Jake received a message summoning him to Director Lewis's office. And when he arrived, he found not just the human administrator, but several other high-ranking Academy officials, including the board chairperson who'd presided over his hearing, Cadet Morrison. "Please sit," Director Lewis said with a warm smile that reached his eyes. "We've asked you here to discuss something important regarding your presence at this academy and what it means for humanity's application to join the Galactic Military Coalition." Jake sat nervously because official meetings with multiple administrators rarely meant anything good in his experience. But the director's next words surprised him completely. "Your conduct over the past months, and particularly your performance,